Welcome to the Story Lab. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's begin. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. Another day, another deal to close. Life was good, or so I thought. My reflection stared back at me, confident and composed. Salvador Bell, the man who had it all. Honey, have you seen my blue folder? Crystal's voice drifted from the bedroom. Check the study, I called back. Our daughter Victoria bounded into the room, her pigtails bouncing. Daddy, can we go to the park after school? I knelt down, meeting her eager gaze. Of course, princess. I'll pick you up at 3:30 sharp. Crystal appeared in the doorway, a distracted look on her face. I've got a late meeting tonight. Don't wait up for dinner. I frowned. Again? That's the third time this week. She waved her hand dismissively. You know how it is. The Henderson account is crucial. Something in her tone didn't sit right, but I pushed the thought aside. All right, I'll take care of Victoria. As Crystal rushed out, barely pausing to kiss Victoria goodbye, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the past few weeks, she'd become increasingly distant. Our once passionate relationship had cooled to tepid small talk and perfunctory gestures. At the office, I found it hard to concentrate. My mind kept wandering back to Crystal's behavior. The canceled plans, the early departures, the way she avoided my touch. It was like living with a stranger. My phone buzzed. A text from Crystal, running late. Don't pick up Victoria. Tracy will drop her off. I sighed, rubbing my temples. This wasn't the first time Crystal had bailed on our daughter. Victoria's disappointed face flashed in my mind, and a surge of anger rose in my chest. As I drove home, I decided to confront Crystal. This couldn't go on. Our family was falling apart, and I needed answers. The house was dark when I arrived. No sign of Victoria or Crystal. I checked my watch 7:30 p.m. Where were they? I dialed Tracy's number, Crystal's closest friend. Hey Tracy, it's Salvador. Is Victoria with you? Oh, hi Salvador. Tracy's voice was overly cheerful. Yes, she's here. Crystal asked me to keep her for a sleepover. Didn't she tell you? My grip tightened on the phone. No, she didn't. Where's Crystal? She said she had a work dinner. I'm sure she'll be home soon. I could hear the lie in Tracy's voice. Thanks, Tracy. Tell Victoria I love her. Hanging up, I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Crystal wasn't at work. She wasn't with our daughter. Where the hell was she? I paced the living room, scenarios racing through my mind. Was she in trouble? Having an affair? The thought made my blood boil. Hours passed. I called Crystal's phone repeatedly, each time going straight to voicemail. By midnight, I was ready to call the police. Then, at 1 a.m., I heard the front door open. Crystal stumbled in, her hair disheveled and clothes wrinkled. Where have you been? I demanded, my voice low and controlled. She jumped, startled by my presence. Salvador. I told you I had a late meeting. Don't lie to me, I growled, stepping closer. I called your office. They said you left at 5. Crystal's eyes darted around the room, avoiding my gaze. I went for drinks with some colleagues. Lost track of time. And your phone? Why didn't you answer? Battery died, she mumbled, pushing past me towards the bedroom. I grabbed her arm, forcing her to face me. What's going on, Crystal? And don't tell me it's nothing. You've been acting strange for weeks. For a moment, I saw fear flash in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by cold defiance. I don't have to explain myself to you, Salvador. Let go of me. I released her arm, shocked by the venom in her voice. This wasn't the woman I married. As she stormed off to the bedroom, I stood there, feeling like my entire world was crumbling around me. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, replaying every interaction, every excuse, every missed call. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. My wife was hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of suspicion and silent tension. Crystal and I barely spoke, dancing around each other like wary strangers. I threw myself into work, but my mind was consumed with uncovering the truth. One evening, as Crystal was getting ready to leave, I casually asked, "Where are you off to?" Book club, she replied, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, watching her rush out the door. As soon as her car pulled away, I grabbed my keys. It was time to end this charade. Following Crystal's car wasn't easy. She took a roundabout route, doubling back several times. But I'd been prepared for this. I kept my distance, heart pounding as we left the familiar streets of our neighborhood behind. Finally, Crystal's car turned into the parking lot of the Rosewood Hotel. A pit formed in my stomach as I watched her step out, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the car window. I parked across the street, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone to record. Crystal walked into the hotel lobby, her eyes scanning the room. Then I saw him, a tall, well-dressed man with sandy hair. He approached Crystal with a familiarity that made my blood boil. Toby Rowe. I recognized him from Crystal's work events. The way he put his hand on the small of her back, the intimate smile they shared, it was all the confirmation I needed. I wanted to storm in there, to confront them both. But a cold, calculating part of my brain held me back. I needed more evidence, more leverage. For the next hour, I sat in my car, taking photos and recording snippets of their conversation whenever they passed by the windows. Each laugh, each touch was like a knife in my heart. When they finally emerged, Toby pulled Crystal close, kissing her deeply. I gripped my steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to run them both down. As Crystal drove away, I followed Toby. He led me to an upscale apartment complex across town. I made note of the address, my mind already formulating a plan. The next day, I called in sick to work. While Crystal was at the office, I paid a visit to Tracy. It was time to get some answers. Tracy opened the door, her fake smile faltering when she saw my expression. Salvador? What are you doing here? I pushed past her into the house. We need to talk, Tracy. Now. She wrung her hands nervously. I don't know what you mean. Cut the crap, I snapped. I know about Toby. I know Crystal's been lying. What I don't know is how long you've been covering for her. Tracy's face crumpled. Salvador, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you, but Crystal, she made me promise. Tell me everything, I demanded, my voice cold. And so, the whole sordid tale came pouring out. Crystal and Toby had been having an affair for months. They were planning to run away together, taking Victoria with them. She was going to leave you bankrupt, Tracy sobbed. Toby's been helping her move money around. They were going to drain your accounts and disappear. I listened in stony silence, each word fueling the rage building inside me. When Tracy finished, I stood up. Salvador, what are you going to do? She asked, fear in her eyes. I looked at her, my voice eerily calm. Nothing for you to worry about, Tracy. But if you breathe a word of this conversation to anyone, especially Crystal, you'll regret it. Understood? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. As I drove to Toby's apartment, my mind was crystal clear. The hurt, the betrayal, it all coalesced into a singular purpose. They thought they could destroy me? I'd show them destruction. Toby's building had lax security. It was almost too easy to slip inside. I picked the lock on his door, a skill from my wilder days that was finally proving useful. The apartment was sleek and modern, reeking of overpriced cologne. I methodically went through drawers and files, photographing everything that could be useful. Bank statements, emails, love letters from Crystal. Each discovery stoked the fire of my rage. I was so focused on my task that I almost didn't hear the key in the lock. Panic surged through me as I realized Toby was home early. There was nowhere to hide. As the door swung open, I made a split-second decision. I grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and positioned myself behind the door. Toby walked in, humming to himself. As he turned to close the door, I struck. The paperweight connected with a sickening thud, and Toby crumpled to the floor. For a moment, I stood there, frozen in shock. Then training kicked in. I checked for a pulse. It was going. Shit, I muttered. This wasn't part of the plan. But as I looked at Toby's lifeless body, a strange calm settled over me. In a way, he'd made things simpler. I surveyed the room, my mind racing. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could control the narrative. Working quickly, I rearranged the apartment to look like a robbery gone wrong. I pocketed some cash and valuables, smashed a window, and wiped down every surface I'd touched. As I left, I felt no remorse, no guilt, only a satisfaction. Toby had tried to take everything from me. In the end, I'd taken everything from him. Now, it was Crystal's turn. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. I had to play the role of the unsuspecting husband while carefully covering my tracks. The news of Toby's death broke quickly, sending shockwaves through Crystal's social circle. I watched her closely, noting every flinch, every poorly concealed tear. She was good at hiding her grief, but not good enough. To the world, she was a concerned colleague. To me, she was a widow in all but name. Such a tragedy, Crystal murmured over dinner, pushing food around her plate. Toby was a valuable member of the team. I nodded solemnly, taking a sip of wine. Indeed, the police say it was a robbery? Crystal's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. That's what they're saying. It's just so senseless. Life often is, I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. As the days passed, Crystal's behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd vacillate between periods of eerie calm and sudden outbursts of anger or tears. I knew it was only a matter of time before she cracked. I needed an ally, someone I could trust implicitly. That's when I turned to my best friend, Santos Witt. Santos and I went way back, to our days in law enforcement training. He'd left the force to start his own security firm, but he still had connections. More importantly, he was the only person I knew I could count on. We met at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. Santos took one look at my face and ordered a bottle of whiskey. "All right, amigo," he said, pouring us each a generous measure. "Spill it." I told him everything: the affair, the plot against me, and finally, what happened with Toby. Santos listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "Damn, Sal, that's one hell of a mess." "I know," I said, downing my drink, "but I need your help, Santos. I can't go down for this. I've got Victoria to think about." Santos leaned back, his eyes shrewd. "What do you need?" "An alibi for the night Toby died. And advice. How to stay ahead of the investigation." For a long moment, Santos just stared at me. Then he nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead, no questions asked." "Got it." Relief washed over me. "Got it. Thank you, Santos." Over the next few hours, we meticulously constructed my alibi. Santos would swear we were together that night, working late on a new security system for my company. We went over every detail, ensuring our stories aligned perfectly. "Now," Santos said, his voice low and serious, "you need to get rid of anything that could link you to Toby's place. Clothes, shoes, everything. Burn it if you have to." I nodded, committing his instructions to memory. "And Salvador," he added, gripping my arm, "no matter what happens, you stick to the story. Even if they bring Crystal in, even if she cracks. You. No. Nothing. Understood?" "Understood," I replied. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The game had changed. It wasn't just about exposing Crystal anymore. It was about survival. The next few weeks were a tightrope walk. At work, I maintained a facade of normalcy, closing deals and charming clients. But inside, I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Crystal's pregnancy announcement came like a bombshell. She cornered me one evening, her eyes wild and desperate. "I'm pregnant, Salvador," she blurted out. It's our miracle." I felt the blood drain from my face. Our miracle. The cruelest joke of all. "That's wonderful news," I managed to choke out, even as my mind raced. The timing, the desperation in her voice, there was no doubt in my mind whose child she was carrying. Crystal threw her arms around me, sobbing. I held her stiffly, my heart turning to stone. She thought this would save her, bind me to her. She had no idea of the storm that was coming. As Crystal pulled away, wiping her eyes, I made a decision. For now, I would play along. Let her think she had one. But in the end, she would lose everything just as she had planned for me. "We should celebrate," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll make dinner reservations for tomorrow." Crystal beamed, relief evident in her eyes. Oh, Salvador. I was so worried. I thought with all the distance between us lately. I cupped her face, the gesture loving but my touch cold. Nonsense. This changes everything. As I held my faithless wife, my mind was already several steps ahead. The child complicated things, but it also opened up new possibilities. If it was Toby's, a paternity test would be damning evidence. If by some miracle it was mine, well, that would make the custody battle much more interesting. Later that night, as Crystal slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts in turmoil. The man I had been trusting, optimistic, maybe even naive was gone. In his place was someone harder, colder, someone who would stop at nothing to protect what was his. I thought of Victoria, innocent and unaware of the chaos swirling around her. I'd shield her from the worst of it, but I knew the coming months would change her life forever. The guilt of that weighed heavily on me, but it was overshadowed by a fiercer emotion, determination. Crystal and Toby had tried to destroy me, to tear my family apart. Instead, they'd unleash something they couldn't have anticipated. I would have my revenge, my justice, and when the dust settled, I'd rebuild my life on the ashes of their betrayal. As dawn broke, I finally drifted off to sleep. In my dreams, I stood triumphant over the ruins of Crystal's carefully constructed lies. It was a vision of the future, one I was determined to make reality. The knock on my office door startled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Detective Fred Phillips standing in the doorway, his keen eyes taking in every detail of my workspace. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice gruff but professional. "I'm Detective Phillips. I was hoping we could talk about Toby Rowe." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my face a mask of polite concern. "Of course, Detective. Please, have a seat." As Phillips settled in, I noticed the way his gaze flickered over my face, searching for any sign of nervousness or guilt. I met his eyes steadily, determined not to give him anything. "Mr. Bell, where were you on the night of July 15th? Phillips asked, pulling out a notepad. I leaned back in my chair, the picture of ease. "I was working late with my friend Santos Witt. We're implementing a new security system for my company. Can anyone else corroborate that?" I shook my head. "Just Santos. We were the only ones in the office that night." Phillips scribbled something down, his expression unreadable. "And your relationship with Mr. Rowe? I understand he worked with your wife." "Purely professional," I replied smoothly. "We'd met at a few work functions, but I didn't know him well." The detective's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your wife seems quite upset by his death." I allowed a flicker of concern to cross my face. Crystal's always been sensitive. Any death is hard on her, especially a colleague. "I see," Phillips murmured. He paused, then asked, "Mr. Bell, are you aware that Mr. Rowe made several large cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his death?" My heart rate picked up, but I kept my expression neutral. "No, I wasn't aware." "Is that significant?" Phillips shrugged. "Could be nothing. But in my experience, when people start moving large sums of cash, they're usually planning something." I leaned forward, injecting just the right amount of curiosity into my voice. "Planning what, exactly?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Phillips replied, standing up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bell. We'll be in touch if we have any more questions." As I watched him leave, I knew this was far from over. Phillips was sharp, too sharp. I'd have to tread carefully. Later that evening, I arrived home to find Crystal pacing in the living room, her face pale and drawn. "Salvador," she said, her voice trembling. "The police were here. They asked so many questions about Toby." I pulled her into an embrace, feeling her shake against me. "It's okay, Crystal. They're just doing their job." She pulled back, her eyes wild. "But what if they find out? What if?" I gripped her shoulders, my voice firm. "Find out what, Crystal? We have nothing to hide." The lie hung between us, heavy and unspoken. Crystal's eyes darted away, unable to meet mine. I just meant about the project we were working on," she mumbled. "It was confidential." I nodded, pretending to accept her flimsy excuse. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine." As Crystal retreated to the bedroom, I poured myself a drink, my mind racing. The investigation was moving faster than I'd anticipated. I needed to accelerate my plans. I pulled out my phone, dialing Santos. "We need to talk," I said as soon as he answered. "Things are heating up." Santos's voice was low and serious. "My place, 1 hour. Come alone." I arrived at Santos's apartment exactly an hour later. He ushered me in quickly, checking the hallway before shutting the door. "What's going on, Sal?" he asked, pouring us each a shot of tequila. I downed mine in one gulp, relishing the burn. "Detective Phillips is onto something. He knows about Toby's cash withdrawals." Santos cursed under his breath. "That complicates things. We need to throw him off the scent." "How?" I asked, refilling my glass. Santos's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "I've got some contacts in the department. Maybe we can plant some evidence, point them in another direction." I hesitated. "That's risky, Santos. If we get caught, if we don't do something, you're going down for murder," Santos snapped. "Is that what you want?" The word hung in the air between us. Murder. What I'd done finally had a name, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. But then I thought of Crystal's betrayal, of the life she and Toby had planned to steal from me. "Do it," I said, my voice cold. "Whatever it takes." Santos nodded, a smile on his face. "That's my boy. Now, here's what we're going to do." As Santos laid out his plan, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and I was all in. The house was quiet when I returned home, Crystal already asleep or pretending to be. I made my way to the study, needing a moment to clear my head. As I settled into my chair, my eyes fell on a stack of papers on Crystal's desk. Something about them nagged at me. I shouldn't look, I knew that. But the investigator in me couldn't resist. Carefully, I began sifting through the documents. Most were mundane work papers, but then I found a hidden compartment in the desk drawer, filled with letters and printed emails. My hands shook as I read through them, each word driving a knife deeper into my heart. "My dearest Toby," one letter began. "I can't wait to start our new life together. Salvador suspects nothing." Another email detailed their plans. "Once we drain his accounts, we'll disappear. He'll be left with nothing, just like he deserves." The cruelty of their scheme hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just planned to leave me. They'd wanted to destroy me completely. As I read on, my shock turned to rage. How dare they? After everything I'd given Crystal, everything we'd built together. I was so engrossed in the letters that I didn't hear the study door open. "Salvador?" Crystal's voice made me jump. "What are you doing?" I turned slowly, the damning evidence clutched in my hand. Crystal's eyes widened as she realized what I'd found. "Let me justify myself," she started, but I cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Justify what, Crystal? How you and your lover planned to ruin me. How you were going to take my daughter, my money, everything." Crystal's face crumpled. "It wasn't like that. Toby. He convinced me." "Don't you dare blame this on him," I snarled, standing up. "Every word here is yours. Your plans, your betrayal." Tears streamed down Crystal's face. "Salvador, please. I made a mistake. We can work this out." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but contempt. This woman, who I'd loved and trusted, was a stranger to me now. "Work it out," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, we'll work it out all right, but not the way you're hoping." Crystal took a step back, fear flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I smiled, and I saw her flinch at the coldness in it. "You wanted to take everything from me, Crystal. Now, I'm going to return the favor." "You can't," she whispered. "The baby." "Ah, yes, the baby," I interrupted. "Tell me, Crystal, is it even mine? Or is this just another part of your sick game?" Crystal's silence was all the answer I needed. I laughed bitterly. "Get out of my sight," I said, turning back to the desk. "And Crystal, don't even think about running. You won't get far." I heard her stifled sobs as she fled the room, but I felt no pity. All I felt was a burning desire for justice, or was it revenge? The next morning, I called Santos. "I need your help again," I said without preamble. "I found more evidence about Crystal. Santos let out a low whistle. Damn, Sal. What do you want to do? I want to destroy her, I said, my voice cold. Legally, financially, completely. Can you help? There was a pause, then Santos chuckled darkly. Oh, I can help all right. Meet me in an hour. We've got work to do. As I hung up, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The man staring back at me was harder, colder than the Salvador Bell of a few weeks ago. But he was also stronger. And he was ready for war. The plan Santos and I concocted was elegant in its simplicity. We would make Crystal believe I was on the verge of confessing everything to the police. The fear of exposure would drive her to desperate measures and right into our trap. I began by dropping hints, leaving files about Toby's case conspicuously around the house. I made hushed phone calls just within Crystal's earshot, speaking vaguely about coming clean and facing the consequences. The effect on Crystal was immediate and dramatic. She became jumpy, her eyes constantly darting around as if expecting the police to burst in at any moment. One evening, as we sat in tense silence at the dinner table, I decided to push things further. I can't do this anymore, Crystal, I said, my voice heavy with feigned guilt. The lies, the secrets, it's eating me alive. Crystal's fork clattered to her plate. What are you talking about, Salvador? I met her gaze steadily. I think it's time I talk to Detective Phillips. Tell him everything I know. The color drained from Crystal's face. Everything you know about what? About Toby, I said softly. About you. Crystal shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't. Salvador, please, think about Victoria. I stood up slowly, letting my face crumple into an expression of anguish. I am thinking about Victoria. She deserves the truth, even if it hurts. As I turned to leave the room, I heard Crystal's sharp intake of breath. Then, suddenly, a searing pain exploded in the back of my head. I stumbled, turning to see Crystal standing there, a heavy vase clutched in her hands. Her eyes were wild, desperate. I won't let you ruin everything, she hissed, raising the vase again. But I was ready this time. I ducked under her swing, tackling her to the ground. We grappled on the floor, Crystal clawing and scratching like a cornered animal. Finally, I pinned her arms above her head, my face inches from hers. It's over, Crystal. I know everything. She went limp beneath me, tears streaming down her face. How? How did you find out? I laughed bitterly. You weren't as clever as you thought. I found your letters, your emails. I know all about your plans with Toby. Crystal's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. You had no right. I had every right, I snarled. You were planning to destroy me, take my daughter, my money, my life. You don't understand, Crystal sobbed. Toby and I, we were in love. We wanted a fresh start. I released her arms, standing up and looking down at her with disgust. And that justified ruining me? Taking Victoria away from her father? Crystal struggled to sit up, her voice pleading. Salvador, please. We can work this out. For Victoria's sake. Don't you dare use our daughter as a bargaining chip, I snapped. You lost that right when you plotted to take her from me. I pulled out my phone, showing her the screen. The voice recorder app had been running the entire time. Crystal's face crumpled as she realized the trap she'd fallen into. What are you going to do? I smiled coldly. Everything you planned to do to me, Crystal. I'm going to take it all, your money, your reputation, custody of Victoria. You'll be left with nothing. You can't, she whispered. Watch me, I replied, turning towards the door. Oh, and Crystal? Don't bother trying to run. Santos has been watching the house. You're not going anywhere. As I walked out, leaving Crystal sobbing on the floor, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and now, finally, I could begin to take back control of my life. But as I got into my car to drive to Santos's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Detective Phillips was still out there, getting closer to the truth every day. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. No matter what came next, I was ready. Crystal and Toby had awakened something in me, a ruthless determination to protect what was mine, no matter the cost. As I pulled up to Santos's apartment, I saw him waiting outside, a smile on his face. "It's done?" he asked as I got out of the car. I nodded, holding up my phone. "Got it all on tape. She confessed everything." Santos clapped me on the shoulder. "Good man. Now, let's go inside and plan our next move. Something tells me we're not out of the woods yet." As we walked into his apartment, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The game had changed, the stakes higher than ever. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. Crystal, Toby, Detective Phillips, they had no idea who they were dealing with. But they were about to find out. The dim light of Santos's apartment cast long shadows as we pored over the evidence we'd gathered. Photographs, bank statements, and Crystal's damning emails were spread across the coffee table. "Something's not adding up," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "These withdrawals from Toby's account, they're too precise, too calculated." Santos leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking, Sal?" I pointed to a series of transactions. "Look at the pattern. It's almost like someone was setting him up," Santos finished, his eyes widening. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces started to fall into place. "Santos, what if Toby isn't dead?" Santos sat back, shock evident on his face. "But you said—" "I know what I thought I saw," I interrupted. "But what if it was staged? What if this whole thing has been an elaborate con?" Santos shook his head. "That's a hell of a long shot, Sal. Why would Toby fake his own death?" I stood up, pacing the room as my mind raced. "Think about it. The perfect crime. He frames me for his murder, runs off with Crystal and my money, and they start a new life somewhere I can't touch them." "But Crystal's still here," Santos pointed out. "Is she?" I countered. "Or is she just waiting for the right moment to disappear?" Santos's eyes narrowed. "If you're right, we need to move fast. Where do we start?" I pulled out my phone, dialing a number I'd hoped never to use again. "We start by calling in some favors. It's time to dig deeper into Toby Rowe's past." Hours later, fueled by coffee and desperation, we had our answer. Toby Rowe wasn't just alive, he was a ghost, a master of reinvention with a string of aliases and cons across 3 continents. "I'll be damned," Santos whispered as we stared at the evidence. "He played us all." Anger surged through me, hot and fierce. "Not yet, he hasn't. We're going to beat him at his own game." Santos looked at me, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "What's the play, boss?" I smiled, a plan already forming. "We're going to catch a dead man." The next morning, I cornered Crystal in the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements jittery as she poured her coffee. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and controlled. Crystal flinched. "Salvador, please. I've told you everything." I leaned against the counter, fixing her with a hard stare. "Have you? Because I think there's one very important detail you've left out." Her hand trembled, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Toby's alive, isn't he?" I said, watching her reaction closely. The color drained from Crystal's face. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Then, to my surprise, she laughed a hollow, bitter sound. "You figured it out," she said, slumping into a chair. "I should have known you would." I sat across from her, my voice cold. "Start talking, Crystal. Tell me everything, and I mean everything." And so, the whole sordid tale came pouring out. Toby's real identity, their elaborate plan to frame me and escape with my fortune. With each word, my anger grew, but so did my determination. "Where is he now?" I demanded when she finished. Crystal shook her head. "I don't know. He was supposed to contact me, but—" Her voice trailed off, fear flickering in her eyes. I stood up, looming over her. "Listen carefully, Crystal. You're going to help me find him, and when we do, you're going to play your part perfectly. Understand?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What are you going to do?" I smiled, a predatory gleam in my eye. "I'm going to give Toby exactly what he wants. And then, I'm going to take everything from him." As I left the kitchen, my phone buzzed. A text from Santos. "Detective Phillips is sniffing around again. We need to move fast." I typed back a quick reply, Set it up. It's time to end this. I went to the meeting, leaving Victoria and Crystal with Tracy. We explained everything to Detective Phillips with evidence we gathered. He was suspicious of us, but as he connected all pieces of the puzzle, he understood our discovery and was shocked. Before we wrapped up the meeting, I got a horrifying call from Tracy. Salvador, Toby came to the house. He took Victoria and Crystal with him by force. He gave me an address and told you to come alone with all the savings and money that you have. Also, he warned you to come alone. I was shocked. I told everything to Detective Phillips and Santos. Detective Phillips immediately set up a team for a rescue and gave me instructions to follow. After an hour later, we were ready to take down Toby. The pieces were in place. Now, it was time for the final act in this twisted game. The warehouse loomed before me, a hulking shadow against the night sky. My heart pounded as I approached, keenly aware of the wire hidden beneath my shirt and the gun tucked into my waistband. Santos's voice crackled in my earpiece. Remember, Sal, we've got eyes on every exit. If Toby shows, we'll nail him. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. And if he doesn't? Then we've still got Crystal's confession. Either way, this ends tonight. I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the cavernous space. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across discarded machinery. Crystal? I called out, my voice echoing. I'm here. Where are you? A muffled sob answered me. I rounded a corner to find Crystal tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Salvador, she cried. Thank God you're here. He said he'd finish Victoria if I didn't cooperate. I rushed to her side, making a show of checking her bonds. Who, Crystal? Who did this? That would be me, a familiar voice rang out. I spun around to see Toby step out from behind a stack of crates, a gun trained on us. The sight of him, alive and smirking, sent a surge of rage through me. Toby, I growled. Or should I say, James Moriarty? That is your real name, isn't it? Toby's eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. Well, aren't you full of surprises, Salvador? I must say, I'm impressed. I straightened up, moving away from Crystal. The game's over, Toby. The police are on their way. He laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've got an insurance policy. He jerked his head towards a dark corner. Come on out, sweetheart. My blood ran cold as Victoria stepped into view, her small hand clasped in the grip of a burly man I didn't recognize. Daddy? Victoria's voice trembled. What's going on? I took a step forward, my hands raised. Let her go, Toby. This is between us. Toby's grin widened. On the contrary, Salvador, this has always been about family. Your family, to be precise. What do you want? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. What I've always wanted, Toby replied. Your money, your life, your identity. And now, thanks to your meddling, I'll have to take your daughter too. Can't leave any loose ends, you understand. Crystal let out a strangled cry. Toby, no. You promised. Toby's face twisted in disgust. Oh, shut up, Crystal. You've outlived your usefulness. In that moment, several things happened at once. Toby swung his gun towards Crystal. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. And through my earpiece, I heard Santos shout, now! The warehouse erupted into chaos. Police officers swarmed in from every entrance. The man holding Victoria was quickly overwhelmed. I grappled with Toby on the floor, fighting for control of the gun. It's over, Toby, I grunted, pinning his arm. Give it up? Toby's eyes blazed with fury. Never, he snarled, headbutting me. I reeled back, my grip loosening. Toby scrambled to his feet, gun raised. Time seemed to slow as I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Then, a single shot rang out. Toby's eyes widened in shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then crumpled to the ground. I turned to see Detective Phillips lowering his weapon. You all right, Mr. Bell? I nodded, still dazed. Victoria? Safe, Phillips assured me. We've got her. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sagged against a nearby crate, watching as paramedics rushed to Toby's side. Santos appeared at my elbow, his face etched with concern. "You did it, Sal. It's over." I shook my head, my eyes fixed on Crystal as she was led away in handcuffs. "Not yet. There's still one more thing to do." In the days that followed, the truth came out. Crystal, facing a mountain of evidence, confessed to everything. Her testimony, combined with the evidence we'd gathered, was enough to clear my name completely. As I sat in my lawyer's office, signing the final divorce papers, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a deep, abiding anger at the betrayal I'd endured. "Mr. Bell," my lawyer said, interrupting my thoughts, "there's one more matter to discuss. Your ex-wife. She's requesting visitation rights for Victoria." I looked up, my jaw clenching. "Absolutely not. She lost that right when she put our daughter in danger." The lawyer nodded. "I thought you might say that. I'll have the papers drawn up to ensure full custody remains with you." As I left the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The nightmare was over. Toby was dead, Crystal was facing years in prison, and most importantly, Victoria was safe. I drove to pick up my daughter from Santos's place, my mind already turning to the future. We had a lot of healing to do, Victoria and I. But we'd do it together, stronger for having survived this ordeal. As I pulled into Santos's driveway, I saw Victoria burst out of the front door, her face lighting up at the sight of me. I scooped her into my arms, holding her tight. "Ready to go home, princess?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Victoria nodded against my chest. "Can we get ice cream on the way?" I laughed, feeling truly happy for the first time in ages. "Anything you want, sweetheart. Anything you want." As we drove away, I caught sight of Santos in the rearview mirror, watching us go. I owed him more than I could ever repay. But that was a conversation for another day. For now, I had a daughter to spoil, a life to rebuild, and a future that, for the first time in a long time, looked bright. Months passed, and slowly, life began to settle into a new normal. The media frenzy around the Bell affair, as they dubbed it, had finally died down. Victoria and I had moved to a new house, a fresh start away from the painful memories of our old life. I sat in my home office, reviewing some contracts when my phone buzzed. A text from Santos. "Turn on the news. Now." Frowning, I flipped on the TV. Crystal's face filled the screen. Her once perfect makeup now absent, her designer clothes replaced by a prison jumpsuit. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "Crystal Bell, convicted conspirator in the infamous Bell affair, has made a full confession implicating several high-profile individuals in a wide-ranging financial fraud scheme." I leaned back in my chair, a mix of emotions washing over me. Part of me was satisfied to see Crystal facing the consequences of her actions. But another part, a part one tried to ignore, felt a twinge of something. Not quite regret, but a sort of melancholy for what might have been. My musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," I called. Victoria peeked her head in, her eyes bright. "Daddy, can we go to the park? You promised we'd practice soccer." I smiled, pushing thoughts of Crystal aside. "Of course, princess. Let me just finish up here." As Victoria skipped off to get ready, I turned back to the TV. Crystal was speaking now, her voice trembling. "I made terrible mistakes," she said, looking directly into the camera. "I hurt people I claimed to love. If I could take it all back, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is tell the truth and face the consequences." I switched off the TV, sighing heavily. The truth. Such a simple concept, yet it had nearly destroyed us all. Later, at the park, I watched Victoria chase after the soccer ball, her laughter carrying across the field. Santos jogged up, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late," he panted. "Work's been crazy since the news broke." I nodded, my eyes still on Victoria. "What's the fallout?" Santos shook his head. "It's big, Sal. Crystal's testimony has opened up a whole can of worms. Arrests, indictments. It's like dominoes falling." I turned to face him. "And us? Are we in the clear?" "Completely," Santos assured me. "Detective Phillips even called to apologize for suspecting you." Said you should consider a career in law enforcement. I laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Santos clapped me on the shoulder. Can't argue with that. So, what's next for Salvador Bell? I watched as Victoria scored a goal against an imaginary goalkeeper, her arms raised in triumph. Honestly, I'm not sure. But for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to finding out. We lapsed into comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warm on our faces. After a while, Santos spoke again, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Listen, Sal, about everything that happened. I know I didn't always make the right choices. If I let you down in any way, I cut him off with a shake of my head. You were there when it mattered, Santos. I wouldn't have made it through without you. Santos nodded, relief evident in his eyes. Still, if there's ever anything you need. Actually, I said, a smile tugging at my lips, there is one thing. Victoria's been asking for a dog. Think you could help me pick one out? Santos laughed, the tension broken. A dog? That's it? After everything we've been through? I shrugged. What can I say? My priorities have changed. As we walked over to join Victoria's impromptu soccer game, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past few months had been a crucible, burning away everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, even myself. But from those ashes, something new had emerged. A stronger bond with my daughter, a deeper appreciation for true friendship, and a resolve to never again take for granted the things that truly mattered. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As Victoria's small hand slipped into mine, her face beaming up at me, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. And really, that was all that mattered. The sun was setting as we left the park, casting long shadows across the grass. Victoria skipped ahead, chattering excitedly about the dog we'd promised to consider. Santos hung back, matching my slower pace. You know, Sal, he said quietly, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about priorities changing. I glanced at him, curious. Oh. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's time I made some changes too. Settle down, start a family. All this cloak and dagger stuff, it takes its toll, you know? I chuckled, remembering the adrenaline-fueled days of our recent past. That it does, my friend, that it does. As we reached the car, Victoria turned to us, her eyes shining. Can Uncle Santos come for dinner? Please, Daddy? I looked at Santos, raising an eyebrow in question. He grinned, shrugging. Well, if the lady insists. And so, as the last light of day faded, we drove home together, a family forged in fire, stronger for having weathered the storm. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, we'd face it head-on, with the unshakable bond of trust and loyalty we'd fought so hard to build. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Victoria's excited chatter with Santos, I felt a surge of determination. The past had tried to break us, but we'd emerged victorious. And now, finally, it was time to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of better days ahead. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.